Hey, hello everybody.
We are now live for our Q&A. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll wait a few more minutes while more people start to join us.
Just to say that we're talking to you today from WWF UK's headquarters here in Surrey, and we're going to be talking to you about why we should care about the Amazon, and what we want is questions from you more than anything, which will help us explain the importance of the Amazon and what we're trying to do to save it.
Yes, and we already received quite a few questions online. A few of them, for example, how many species there are in the Amazon? How did it used to look like? And what is this irreversible tipping point that lots of people are talking about? And more importantly, what can we do from the UK to support the work that is being done to protect the Amazon? So maybe we'll just wait a minute or two while more people join. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, so I mean, while we're waiting, Belle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Belle Lyon. I work here at WWF UK in the Latin America team in conservation programs. I am originally from Brazil, but I've been here in the UK for quite a long time, working in the Amazon, mainly focusing on Brazil. How about you, Jamie?
Hi there, yeah, I'm Jamie Gordon. I work in the same team as Belle. The difference is that I'm not Brazilian, I'm English, you can probably tell. But I've had the good fortune to work in Latin America for most of my career. It happens that my work here in WWF focuses more on the Colombian Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon than the Brazilian Amazon, unlike Belle. So we've got two different perspectives there.
And today we're really happy to celebrate Amazon Day, International Amazon Day, when we're here to talk about this incredible rainforest, but also shine a light on the threats and the deforestation that is happening there. Yeah.
Okay, then should we kick off with the first question?
Sure. So Jamie, could you tell us a little bit about how old the Amazon is?
Right, okay, so the thing you're going to get on this is that it's often quite difficult to answer simple questions with straightforward answers about the Amazon because it's a vast, complex, and as yet not entirely understood forest. But that's a really good question. How old is it? Scientists tell us that you can trace the origins of the Amazon as a forest back 55 million years, which makes it one of the oldest rainforests on Earth. But there's perhaps a key moment in its history from which which is worth looking back on, and that's happened about 10 million years ago, when that vast range of mountains called the Andes, which is over there on the Pacific western side of the South American continent, when that got big enough, the rivers stopped flowing through the Andes and started coming back the other way. At that point, the Amazon River started to flow back from the western side, the Pacific side, back towards the Atlantic, where the rain had originally come from, the Atlantic. So that's when the Amazon as a basin, as a water cycling system, really took on the characteristics that we understand it to have today.
Interesting. And actually, one thing to add is that a common misconception that people in general have is that when the Europeans arrived in the Amazon region around 1500, it was sort of this completely empty and pristine forest. But actually, in reality, archaeologists have found that Amazon populations have lived there for tens and thousands of years and have really complex societies in terms of their social, political, and economic systems.
So the Amazon has undergone a lot of changes during its history, natural ones due to climate and other factors, but also because of human ones. And so, as Belle was saying, I think, human beings have lived in the Amazon, been part of it for at least 12,000 years and maybe longer. Yeah.
So, Jamie, another question that came in is about how many species there are in the Amazon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a favorite question, and it's not an easy one to answer as well because we don't know enough. Scientists tell us they estimate that there's maybe 10% of all the world's species live in the Amazon, but when it actually comes to number, we just don't know, not least because of those small things, those bugs, those insects and the spiders and all that, which might not be your favorite creatures, but they're incredibly important. And those species exist in the tens of thousands, and vast numbers not yet known to science. So to actually see, you can only make the crudest estimates of how many there are. But if we go back to that idea that there's about 10% of the Earth's terrestrial species there, that makes the Amazon forest the most diverse forests on Earth. I can give you some estimates of the vast numbers of species by comparing them to here in the UK. So, for example, if we think about the UK, we have maybe 6 or 7 amphibians. That's, frogs and newts and things. There are over 400 species of frogs, newts, and other amphibians in the Amazon. Over 400. That's extraordinary. Reptiles, likewise, we have 6 in this country. There are over 350 reptiles, species of reptile in the Amazon. So there's this vast numbers of species. And also, I think this is a really good moment to emphasize something. We tend to think of the Amazon as a forest. Well, yes, it is a forest, but it's a forest that absolutely depends on water. It's a vast freshwater system of lakes and rivers, which means it's also the most diverse freshwater system on Earth. There are over 3,000 species of fish in the Amazon and its rivers, which is extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, that is really, really incredible. And just to give just a little bit more about the sheer scale of the Amazon, it spans over 9 countries and an area that is twice the size of India and approximately 322 times the size of Wales.
Wow. So we talked a lot about species, but we haven't talked about actually what might be the most important species, Belle.
Humans, of course. So we know that over 30 million people living in the Amazon forest currently, and about 350 indigenous groups live in the Amazon, of about 60 of them still living in pretty much isolation from what we call Western society.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think there are still communities of people who choose to live completely outside of contact with the likes of us. But indigenous people in the Amazon, they exist in all sorts of states. Lots of them are farmers, lots of them live in towns. More people live in towns and cities in the Amazon than outside of town cities. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. The Amazonian urban centers are really large. But I think what's really important for us to emphasize here is the really critical role the indigenous peoples are playing in protecting the forest and their own lands, and we really work hand in hand with them to support their work.
But let's not forget as well those non-indigenous people, the farmers, who've also, many of them been living there for many generations. They can often be really important allies in their work and have every right to be living, getting a life, having a life in the Amazon. But it's interesting, isn't it? We talked about the species diversity. It's uncanny how the Amazon is not just the most diverse tropical forest, it's just about one of the most diverse places culturally, because so many of those indigenous cultures have their own languages and their own customs and everything. So it's
and lived there, as we were saying, for over millennia, and have created really strong connections to the natural world, and have lived in a really important way of protecting the environments they're living in. Jamie, a really important question that has come in is about the importance of the Amazon as for the world's climate.
Wow.
Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I guess I should have predicted this one. Just say there's something interesting here that when I started my career in conservation, which goes back a little longer than I'm going to actually admit to, when I started, we didn't talk about climate. We just talked about the other threats. We didn't really grasp that climate, that there's this issue about how climate is changing. Now more than ever, so much of our work is about the effects of climate, how we stop climate change and how we adapt to it happening. And what I've also come to understand, and scientists have led the way in teaching us this, is just how critical the Amazon is in regional and global weather systems. It's a little bit complex, but one of the things that the Amazon does is it sort of regulates the weather in the northern part of South America. I think, Belle, sometimes you like to call it, rather than the lungs of the earth, what do you call the Amazon?
Well, I find it really interesting how some people call it the air conditioning of the planet, because of the role the Amazon play in terms of this really important cooling down system for keeping the planet in the temperatures we need for a safe future. For example, we know that if we lose the Amazon, we will lose our ability to keep the planet cool up to 1.5 degrees.
So let's bear down a little bit into how that might happen. So you have to understand how the fact that most of the moisture in the air that feeds the Amazon comes from the Atlantic side, on the eastern side of this vast area, which the Amazon covers right across from almost one side of the continent to the other. And that all comes in, and a lot of it, obviously, it falls as rain, but it gets recycled very quickly, evaporates out, and it gets transported up to the trees, back into the atmosphere. So it's been recycled time and time again before it gets to the other side. where the Andes are, and that's where lots of the rain falls, and those vast rivers, the Amazon and its many tributaries, transport all that water straight back in. But you realize that recycling is so important. The Amazon depends on its own ability to recycle water. But there's also another thing here, which I think is sometimes not understood so well, is that some of that moisture that keeps getting recycled and put back into the atmosphere, once it reaches the western side, the Andes, some of it then gets pushed south by the Andes, outside the Amazon basin itself. And there it starts to feed the rainfall, which falls on some of South America's most productive agricultural regions. And if they're the most productive agricultural regions in the whole of South America, that means they're of global importance to global food systems. So the Amazon is not just about regulating rainfall within the Amazon, but also outside of it. And we've not even started to talk about the carbon store yet.
Yeah, absolutely. The Amazon actually is, as you would imagine, with so many trees, is a huge carbon storage and sink. It's about billions of tons of carbon, but it's like saying, it's not, those numbers probably don't mean anything to us. We need a full comparison.
Yes, I mean, we talked about how many billions of tons are held in the Amazon, in the trees, the leaves, the roots, the soil, all that. It's a huge number. But it turns out there's something like that the whole of the carbon that the British nation emits every year, which of course we're fighting hard to reduce, part of our international commitments to reduce carbon emissions in UK. That is something like 1/300th of all the carbon that's stored in the Amazon. So you can imagine if you start to lose the Amazon and that carbon begins to escape into the atmosphere, that could completely undermine all our attempts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from industrial and non-industrial countries. Yeah. So it's not just about regulating climate now, it's about preventing even further climate change. So the escape of a vast amount of carbon currently held in that system. Yeah.
Thanks, Jamie. That's really, really interesting. And also, when we think about how much we already lost the Amazon, and this is one of the questions that has come in, how much is already being destroyed. And scientists say that about 17% of the Amazon has already been destroyed. And they also say that lots of research that is showing that if we keep destroying the forest at this pace, we will get to what we call a tipping point, or a point of no return. Jamie, can you tell us a little bit about what is this tipping point?
Gosh, yeah. So the point perhaps about tipping point to get to the end is what it represents. What the idea is, there could possibly be quite a sudden change and an irreversible change. We'll come in what the Amazon is, and we'll come back to that. But to explore, give you an idea of why scientists think this might happen. I've mentioned that moisture, humidity in the air moves from the Atlantic side in the east all the way across to the Andean western side of the Amazon, and that is being recycled. You can think of it kind of like a conveyor belt. Simply, you can imagine there's a conveyor belt moving this water, this moisture across the continent. Now, if you start doing things at one end of that conveyor belt to break it down, to stop the forest functioning, that means that moisture doesn't get to the other end. So if you start destroying forest in one part of the Amazon, it'll have a knock-on effect in other parts. And that way, you might just think you're just losing a little bit more each year, but suddenly you might find that the bit you're losing this year is causing another bit to dry out and to be lost. And when Amazonian forest dries out, it gets much more susceptible to burning. It begins to change. It starts to be different type of vegetation, possibly more savanna, possibly what we might call dry forest. But either way, types of vegetation which hold less species, less carbon, and which the local people aren't used to living with. So that's the concern about the tipping point, is that idea that we could be, and we don't for sure know how far away we are from this, we could be allowing the Amazon to move to a state where it changes radically and quickly and irreversibly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very important for us all to be aware of, and also trying to understand what are the threats behind this tipping point. So a lot of people have asked us about, in terms of products, and what are the key drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. So as far as our work is concerned, and our partners on the ground are saying and showing, commodities such as beef and soy are one of the largest drivers of not only the Amazon, but tropical forest deforestation. So we know that the products that we buy in the UK and globally are contributing to that deforestation.
Well, that's really apt, because you just got a question about what are precisely the biggest impacts caused by humans on the forest. And Belle, you mentioned their agriculture. I think sometimes simplistically we simply say that the thing that the Amazon is most often turned into is pasture for cattle.
Yes.
And that's true in quite a lot of the Amazon nation. So beef farming is very important, but you also mentioned soy, and there's a lot of other things. Do you want to? So I think we could agree that's the single biggest thing, but the other ones would include.
Well, for instance, illegal gold has been increasing massively in the past few years in the Amazon, and driving not just deforestation, but also degradation and pollution of rivers through the mercury contamination that is used in the gold extraction. And we know from studies that show that the UK is one of the largest importers of gold that is potentially coming from areas such as the Amazon in the region. So, it's really, so gold is also a key driver of the destruction. And as Jamie was saying, the food production continues to be incredibly high. And the irony of that, and I think that's really interesting to know, as you were talking about the water cycle of the Amazon, is the more those cultures grow in the Amazon, they are drying that, decreasing the water cycle, which in turn are affecting their production, that are becoming drier and drier every season. Yeah,
it's interesting as well. And Belle mentioned their gold mining. It's difficult to imagine, perhaps if you've not seen it, go online and go looking for Amazonian gold mining. But it's not like we imagine coal mining, say, in Britain. It's not about burying underground. It's about clearing areas of forest around rivers, and it really does look horrible. They really scarify everything. Everything goes. And as Belle mentioned, it's not just the deforestation itself, but perhaps even more important is the pollution, the mercury. They use mercury in extracting the gold from water, which travels down the rivers. It gets into the fish. It accumulates in some of their favorite species like dolphins, and of course, freshwater fisheries are so important for the well-being of people who live in the Amazon. So people are increasingly eating mercury-contaminated fish, which is scary. But there's another one which just because people always ask about logging as well as a part of Amazonian deforestation. And of course, logging does happen. What happens often with logging is what is done before the cattle people arrive, or the gold miners arrive, or whatever. So you tend to log areas which are not too far from the road and the like. So logging is very often a part of it, but it's not so often that someone just goes out, logs a forest, and then it's destroyed. Perhaps more to the point, the loggers, by opening up those roads, allow other people to get in. And that's sometimes, those kind of things, roads and infrastructure, sometimes a way in which destruction begins to spread through the Amazon. Is that right?
Yeah, it is, Jamie. And I think that brings us to a really important moment for us to talk a little bit about the work that we are doing and the work that our partners on the ground are doing to protect the Amazon. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, I should talk about colleagues who we work with in Peru and Colombia. So yes, we mentioned beef. We have a couple of projects working on different aspects of how to do beef farming better. What we don't often want to do is tell a farmer that you can't live here anymore and grow cattle. We wouldn't be able to if we wanted to. We'd be very unpopular if we did, and we'd fail, because once we leave, they'll come back. So there are ways of doing beef farming better, so you don't need to deforest more land. So we talk about regenerative beef farming, things like that, and trying to get those farmers, and then looking at those landscapes where beef is farmed and say, well, what more could we put back into this landscape to look after biodiversity? I mean, you think of Britain. Britain doesn't have very much native forest left anymore. But we know that an awful lot of biodiversity can be conserved outside of forest by farmers if they do clever things, and if they try and maintain connectivity between areas of forest by hedges, by having trees on farm. So we try to make beef farming less destructive, and we work with governments to try and prevent more beef farmers arriving, obviously. That's one of the key things in Colombia and in Peru. We just touched on infrastructure. They're trying to control and regulate where roads particularly get built is very important. Roads are very important for economic development. People want economic development. If you're living in a poor community and the school or the hospital is 10 miles away up a dirt track, you want that to be paved, and I can understand that. But there are ways of doing things, of planning them, so that you mitigate the worst of that, and then you have good governance afterwards, so that people don't just use that road as a way of colonizing, taking all the forest on either side. I don't know, I think the bigger other big bits of infrastructure is at the moment to talk about the work you do on dams in Brazil in particular.
Yes, no, absolutely. So the problem with hydroelectrical dams and large-scale projects like that is that they're incredibly damaging in terms of stopping the rivers from flowing as they used to be. So what that means that species that were able to migrate from one area to another stop doing that. But also the flow of the river, as Jamie was saying, so important for local people's livelihoods and food security, and now threatened because they not what they used to be. So one of the alternatives that we have been working on is looking across the whole energy sector and looking for alternatives in terms of what are the solar opportunities and the wind opportunities and ways of generating energy that are much more sustainable than what we always consider to be sustainable, which is hydroelectric dams, which in fact is very, very destructive.
And I've just got another question here about soy. I think you mentioned soy, and particularly in Brazil, that's a big issue. How does that impact upon the Amazon? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, so soy, as I was mentioning earlier, is one of the largest drivers of deforestation, not just in the Amazon, but in other ecosystems in Brazil, for example, the Cerrado, and other ecosystems in South America, such as the Chaco, the Pantanal. And unfortunately, soy is not necessarily, I mean, the majority of the soy that we consume, we don't really know we are consuming because it's used to feed, for example, poultry and beef and meat in other countries. So basically, soy is then embedded into our food systems, and it's very difficult for us to distinguish between what is actually driving deforestation on our normal food plate. However, we have been working with the soy sector and with commodities and supply chains to try to ensure they commit to cut-off date to end deforestation in their supply chains. Yeah. So, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, there's something called the soy moratorium, which is a business agreement between sellers and buyers that doesn't allow them to buy any soy that comes from areas that were deforested after 2008.
Yeah, that's interesting. What Belle's not saying there is that we're trying to stop all soy production, because that would be very difficult. But I mean, soy is actually, in some ways, it's a very important crop. It's it's very productive, and the global food chain, to feed us all, we need crops like soy, but we don't want more land in the Amazon being given over to soy. So it's about how to control its growth and get the best out of the land where we are growing it. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And just to emphasize, like, it's not the soy milk or the tofu or those sort of primary products of soy that are driving deforestation. The majority is for when it feeds animals such as beef and chicken and others. So it's really important for us to be aware of that.
I'm sorry, but I keep being given the questions, which means I keep asking you, which is a bit unfair. Sorry about that. But I guess it's inevitable. People are asking, what about protected areas? How do we deal with those? What role do they have in conserving the animals?
That's an absolutely critical point, because as we know, deforestation in the Amazon is a hugely complex issue, and we're not going to solve it by one silver bullet. We really need to work on various strategies and initiatives. But if I had to pick one that I think is the most effective, and evidence does show that protected areas, primarily indigenous territories and local communities, demarcated lands, are the best ways of protecting the forest. And if we look across the Amazon and look at maps and look at satellite images, we can see that those areas have become real islands of forest and biodiversity. So we need to do everything we can to support those communities who are really at the forefront of protecting the forest, so they can continue to keep those areas standing, which are so important for their own livelihoods as well. So we really work hand in hand with those communities to ensure that not only those areas protected, but that their voices are heard and they are part of decision-making processes that affect them.
That's really interesting, Bill, because what you're kind of saying that there's this traditional idea of a protected area as a place where if it's done, I mean, in a way which you just don't want to see anymore, no one's allowed in this protected. To think about a protected area as being equally a place where people live, or it can be an indigenous reserve. Yes. And that makes me think of some of the work our colleagues do in WWF Colombia with when they've worked with the Park Service on better management of protected areas and even expansion of them. It's always done with and by the local people, including the indigenous communities, to the point at which in some instances where park expansion has been proposed, our colleagues in Colombia said, no, the message we're getting from indigenous people, they don't want that. They like the rights they already have to protect the forest they want. Well, that's great, because as Belle says, what we do tend to find is where indigenous people live and have, you know, the rights to control their land, and that's key. Help them to be able to, you know, exercise those rights is key. We often find there is the solution, and there's a long-time solution.
And just to give a little bit of evidence, we know that even though indigenous peoples are less than 5% of the world's population, in those territories where they are living, they hold about 80% of the world's biodiversity.
That's globally true. That's
globally true, across the world, and especially in the Amazon.
I'm just really conscious about time. One of the things is we wanted to talk about, and it's a question we asked a lot, you know, outside of this kind of Q&As, is what can someone, say, living in the UK do to, you know, to help conserve the Amazon? Would you like to give us a couple of ideas?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you, Jamie. I think that's a really critical question, because we often think we live so far away from the Amazon. That's a distant problem that we here shouldn't be worried about. And actually, this is completely wrong, because as we were saying, the things that we buy, the things that we eat, the things that we consume on an everyday basis do affect what's happening in the Amazon. And at the same time, what's happening there is affecting the climate, is affecting us here. So it's really important that we take actions. So I'm just going to suggest one. And
Sure, yeah.
So for me, like a really important thing in my journey has been to learn about it. So the more we learn about something, a subject, we really try to understand more and understand what we can do. So my suggestion would be like, read more, learn more, listen to podcasts. There's so many really exciting new, even indigenous, local indigenous peoples broadcasting what's happening live. So go and learn more, and then spread the word to your friends, your family, your teachers, your school friends. And yeah, I think that's a good start.
That's a really good start. And I think when you do that, you'll be inspired to do more. And I'd say something that's surprising, I think you should think about is, you know, getting in contact with your MP, telling them they're important, because actually the British government is reasonably generous at the moment in supporting Amazonian conservation. Some of the reasons that me and Belle are engaged with our colleagues in Colombia and Brazil and Peru is because we are managing funds which originate with the British government. We have a commitment in Britain called the International Climate Finance, which relates to the big climate agreements, that we should help support less well-off nations meeting their climate targets. The way the British government said they're going to do that is through using international climate finance to support the Amazon forest. Of course, when times are difficult, politicians start thinking about, well, maybe we could spend that money closer to home and all that kind of stuff. So write to your MP, tell them you think the Amazon is important, tell them you want Britain to carry on supporting its conservation.
Yeah, so maybe if we final seconds before we close, I just want to say, be part of the change. So think about your everyday decisions. So we were talking earlier about how beef is a major driver of deforestation. So we're not saying everyone needs to become vegetarian, but try to slowly decrease the consumption of beef in your everyday lives. Try to think about when you're buying, for example, new earrings for someone, ask the questions about where it's coming from, and think about alternatives in terms of recycled gold and other materials that are not causing as much destruction.
Yeah, and I would say, and of course, keep in touch with WWF, keep on those web pages, see what else you might contribute. There's loads more you can do.
Yes, and join us as members. We really appreciate everyone's support, and we couldn't do the work that we do without the support we receive from the public. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be really happy to answer any more questions that come our way via our website, via email. So thank you.
I think thanking you might be the most important message. Thank you very much.